The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 13th chapter. Glory to you, Lord. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Lord, look, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." The Gospel of the Lord. So with the presidential elections now less than a year away, and the rise of terrorism even before Friday's attacks in Paris, and all of the folks who have been attacked or had nasty things done to them because of their race or their religion, there are all kinds of important things that fill our news feeds and compete for our attention. And so it was that this past week, our news feeds, at least mine and probably yours too, asked us to consider that most important of all problems in the universe, whether or not the world was coming to an end because Starbucks removed snowflakes from their holiday cups. I saw that, and all the people that responded to that, and the one that was the best response to that was somebody in this congregation had posted this thing, this hashtag, "Are you serious?" Really? But some people were serious about that. For some folks, when you take even secular images like snowmen and snowflakes off of holiday cups, it was the equivalent of saying, "I hate Jesus." I swear I am not making this up. I actually saw people who said that's what it really amounted to. And when that happens for me, I'm sitting there and I go, you know what, I want to keep using that hashtag, "Are you serious?" Because just like that, the Starbucks coffee cup controversy became the opening salvo in the now traditional and very predictable accusations that there is a war on Christmas. And to me, that always seems both silly and wrong, to think that there really is a war on Christmas, but some people really think that there is. And here's the reality that sets off a lot of people who really do believe there's a war on Christmas. Our society has changed and is changing. We're a multicultural and a multi-religious society. In fact, when you look at all of the polls, the largest, fastest growing religious group in the United States is the group of people who say we practice no religion. We don't even say that we have a religious affiliation anymore. And many of the people who celebrate Christmas do so only culturally. They don't go to church, and they don't care at all about any of the religious underpinnings. And so governments and secular companies like Starbucks, who want and need to appeal to a wide and diverse constituency, have adapted to that new reality. But if, even subconsciously, you've lived your life really believing that somehow this is supposed to be a Christian country, and that Christian religion and Christian trappings should simply be part of the unchanging fabric of society and government, that new reality can shake the very core of what it means to live in this country. And the simple replacement of Happy Holidays for Merry Christmas can make it feel as though your world is collapsing. And often, what seems like an apocalyptic change to one set of people can seem like that hashtag, "Are you serious?" to another group, particularly if you're not part of the same culture. And that is why it is really, really easy for all of us to pass pretty quickly over this story about the temple in today's gospel reading. The story begins with Jesus and his disciples walking through this enormous and impressive temple complex in Jerusalem. It was totally unlike anything any of his disciples would probably ever have seen. And so they stand there as they're walking through the complex with their eyes bulging, their mouths gaping, and they start to sound like Little Red Riding Hood. "My teacher, what big stones these are." And this prompts Jesus to start to talk to them about what's going to happen when all of these big stones are thrown down and the temple gets destroyed. This story features prominently in all the Gospels because less than 40 years later, there was a Jewish revolt, and the Romans did, in fact, destroy the temple. The stones were literally thrown down, and the temple was never rebuilt. But for Jesus' disciples, for all the Jews, and really for everybody living at that time and in that place, the destruction of the temple was more than simply a big building getting knocked down. Instead, it represented a whole way of life that was going to be forever changed. It was for them an apocalyptic event that made it feel like their whole world had collapsed. The destruction of the temple represented the collapse of the social and the political structure of life. This was one of the unifying places where people came together from all over the world. It was one of the kind of unchanging places that you could rely on, and it was there. It was, of course, a place where people came to worship, but not only did Jews gather and worship there, but later on we learn in the book of Acts that it became central for Christians as well. That's where Christians gathered to praise God. It was a big communal area, and it was actually one of the few places where the Romans kind of kept their hands off of it. The Romans decided that every time they walked into the Temple Mount and carried some image of one of their pagan gods, everybody rioted, and it was bad for them. So they kind of stayed away, and people had this sense that a piece of our society, it's still there because this temple is there. And when that went away, people's whole sense of what their society was also went away. The destruction of the temple was the collapse and the representation of the collapse of the religious status quo. There was, and could only be, one temple. There are synagogues in our community which are named temple, but in fact in the biblical period, there was only one temple. It was in Jerusalem. It was where people came to make sacrifice, and then there were synagogues where people gathered for prayer and everything, but the temple formed one of the key cornerstones of religious life together. And without it, Jews needed to figure out, how can we be Jews without the temple being there? But it had an effect for Christians too, because the early Christian community centered its life and its missionary activity out of Jerusalem and out of the temple. And when that went away, Christians also had to figure out, how do we live as a community without this central place in our lives? The whole status quo had been destroyed. And maybe most importantly, the destruction of the temple represented the collapse of a sense of stability of the world around people. They figured, you know what? If the temple goes away, what else could happen? Even though the Romans, who were a nation state, knocked the temple down, what they were endeavoring to do in knocking down the temple was not just to knock down a building, but to do the very same thing that ISIS was trying to do in Paris on Friday. They were trying to demoralize people. They were trying to scare people. They were trying to cow people into a sense of submission. And when something like that happens in your life, it makes people go, oh my gosh, what could happen next? And that's what the people were feeling. And they anticipated that, so the disciples say to Jesus, wow, when this happens, it must be the end of life as we know it. It must be the end of all things. How could we possibly go on living in an environment in which the social, the political, the cultural environment has so changed and so collapsed around us? And in a sense, Jesus' response to them is that same hashtag, are you serious? And then Jesus begins to tell them plainly that it is not going to be the end of all things. And while it will be difficult and very painful, there's still more to come, and more that God will be calling them to do. So rather than encouraging them to look for the signs of imminent destruction all around them, Jesus instead called his first disciples, and he calls us, to be people who trust that God and God's plans are greater than anything that is a calamity happening around us. That God is not undone by all of the catastrophes that we see happening in our day-to-day lives. Because throughout the centuries, Christians have seemed to worry that every time, in spite of what Jesus says, every time there is another war, or an earthquake, or a famine, or some other kind of catastrophe happening around us, it must mean that God has forgotten about us, forsaken us, or somehow lost control of history or our lives. Jesus, rather, says to us, God is still in control of you. God has not lost control just because of the calamity du jour. You know, the temple got destroyed, but the Jews survived. The Christian community survived. That's part of the point that Jesus wants us to see. God has a future for all of us beyond any kind of calamity that might happen. Jesus told his first disciples, and he tells us, that rather than look for some kind of sign of imminent destruction in our world, we should instead be people who are not distracted by those calamities. Not even by the stuff that darn well should be distracting. Not by wars, or wars on Christmas. Not by rumors of wars. Not by anything else. And the point is this, that when we're distracted by the latest catastrophe or horrible thing that's going on, we can't possibly pay attention to what God is doing in us and with us, and how God is calling us to be witnesses in the midst of the horrible, scary stuff that's going on in our world. And so maybe most importantly, Jesus called his first disciples, and he calls all of us to be people who are not fixated on whatever the imminent sign of destruction is, but rather who are people who are willing to adapt and change along with our changing world. Because it's sometimes fun to rail against the darkness, but adaptive people light candles and turn on the lights. After the temple got destroyed, Jews figured out how to make synagogues the center of their religious life together. Christians ended up fanning out and making disciples in places that they never imagined before because they weren't so fixated on Jerusalem and the temple as having to be the center of everything they did in their lives. God actually worked through people in ways that they could not imagine, in spite of and sometimes because of the calamities that they faced. In fact, our societies and our cultures are always changing, and there are always scary things going on around us. But Jesus' call is never to rebuild the temple so that things can go on as before, but rather to be ready and willing to adapt and be faithful in the midst of whatever happens. Jesus told his first disciples, and he tells us today, that there will always be wars and rumors of wars and all kinds of scary stuff that really does shape the foundations of our lives. But rather than telling us to duck and cover, Jesus instead calls us to trust that God has not lost control of history or of our lives. Jesus cautions us against being distracted by all the scary stuff that's going on around us. And most of all, Jesus calls us to be faithful in ways that empower us to adapt to new situations so that we can be his witnesses, no matter what seems to be happening or changing in the world around us.